Well, good morning, everyone, and I'm pretty sure there will be others coming in, so I can expect that. Today's session is on the role of serendipity in our lives. And as a questioning liberal arts graduate, I had to be sure that we have an understanding of terms here. So I did some incredibly difficult, long, and laborious research into the term serendipity. I Googled it. And it is interesting, though. I learned that it is from a variant of Sri Lankan language that was coined by, or the actual term serendipity was coined by Horace Walpole in 1754, based on the Persian story, The Three Princes of Serendip, who were, quote, always making discoveries by accidents and sagacity of things which they were not in quest of. So that's what we're here for. TJ?
Did you end that sentence with a preposition?
This is 1750. This was 1754. This was 1754. They didn't worry about that. But at any rate, the dictionary definition really is a combination of events which have come together by chance to make a surprisingly good or wonderful outcome. For today's presentations, any outcome is going to be fine. Well, whatever stories you have, we'd love to hear. We do have a few kind of logistics issues here. First of all, I think we have enough time in that we do not have to be finished by 11 o'clock this morning. We can probably stay here until 11:30, perhaps even beyond that, if needed. And the whole purpose, of course, of this is to engage each other in conversation. So looking forward to that. Secondly, we are being Zoomed, and I don't know if we have others who have joined us yet, but hopefully they will be. And for them to hear us, we have a microphone which we will pass around for any of you when you wish to give your story. We do ask, however, that you try to limit your talk to, let's say, 3-4 minutes or so. We don't have a hook here, so it's not absolutely essential. Yeah, but we will shut off the microphone and that'll do the same. Okay, well, welcome everyone. May we have a first volunteer?
Hey, you start.
Well, I was prepared to do that. Stuart?
Sure. So I guess my story of serendipity began in high school. Senior year in high school, there were four of us. There were four of us who went in. I think it was Phoenicia, New York. Went mountain climbing, hill climbing, and we get to the top of the mountain and we have some dry food and we're behind it. We don't know which end is up, and we're sleeping outside in our sleeping bags, and two people come up the mountain. One guy is kind of diminutive, about 5'6", gray hair, looks around 45, 50 years old. And then this big, like halfback, comes up with him. And then and so we're sort of in one campsite and they're maybe 10 yards away, 15 yards away, 20 yards away, doing their thing. They put up a tent. The big guy pulls off this huge backpack. The other guy had a little one. And we see a revolver, okay, a gun in the holster. So what's going on here? And so, and then what happens? So then they get out some steaks, they get out some cocktails, and they invite us over. Okay. And so these four guys are coming over and being introduced to this, and with wide eyes. So what ends up happening is, of the four of us, for some reason, Nick, the guy's name is Adams Nickerson. His brother was a Nassau County executive, and he has all kinds of real estate holdings in New York. They go back to the Mayflower. So he's the shorter guy, and it ends up that Walter is his chauffeur and bodyguard. Okay. And what happens is that senior year, and he takes a liking to me, and we exchange contact info. And for the next 4 years, and I'm sorry that Ben's not here, Nick, that's what we called him, would call us up and say, we'd love to take you on a hike. And so it would happen about twice a year throughout Trinity and he said, bring a friend. We're going to go on a day hike. And so we went on, so he'd come up in a limo and Walter would be driving it, this big guy, okay? And he'd come up to Trinity and Ben and I would get in the limo and we'd drive up and go on a day hike. And at the end of the day hike, we'd go to the fanciest restaurant in whatever town that is, okay? And he would treat us to everything. And part of what we learned to do was, and Susan met him eventually and he's died, but we've kept friendship until he passed away. But one of the things he taught us to do was how to snip a cigar. Maybe I'm going to teach you guys this, how to snip a cigar and dip it in brandy before you start. And so here we are, these guys, we're smoking these cigars and we just went on this walk, and he's going to take us back to Trinity the next day. It was great fun. And that's my story. So,
I'll go. I have a second story if I want to tell it, but the first one actually started here at our senior year at spring, and I did not know what the hell I wanted to do. Basically, I was a physics major and I didn't want to go on in physics, but that's all I knew. And I had never really talked much about the Vietnam War. I knew it was in the background, and I knew I was likely to get drafted. So I figured, well, if I'm going to get drafted, I probably should try to learn something in the military that might be useful later. So I applied to flight school for the Air Force. And I went through all of the aptitudes tests that they did, passed those with flying colors. First time I said that it wasn't intended, but and I go up for the physical up to Springfield up there, the air base. And you have to fill out the medical history and beforehand, and then you go in for the actual physical. And when I'm about a half hour into the physical, the guy comes over and says, you can go home now, you flunked the physical already. I said, what? And it turns out that in the history that you put in, you had to put down any hospitalizations that you had ever had. So I put tonsils, appendix, things like that. And I handed the thing in, but at the last second, I just remembered that, oh yeah, I had a fractured skull when I was 6 years old. And that was because as a kid, we went playing around in the new band wing that they were building at the high school, what 6-year-olds do. And so I had been in the hospital for a week. And so they denied me, that kept me out of the Air Force. And when I look back on it, I say, if I hadn't done that, and hadn't even remembered it, I mean, they never would have known about a fractured skull, but if I had not even remembered that at the last second, I could have been a neighbor of John McCain's. Basically.
I like
I know, and I realized that, that was really a turning moment, a very serendipitous accident. And actually, the second thing is really brief, and it also involved only the other second time that I ever had broken bones in my body. And I was with the same kid, but it was like 50 years later. And we were on a bike ride in Boulder, beautiful bike trails through Boulder. And I hadn't been on a bike for a long time, so I was just kind of getting adjusted to it. And all of a sudden, I was playing around with the gear shift. All of a sudden, the path went down with a sharp turn on the end. And I didn't find the brakes in time. So I ended up in the Boulder Creek that was right across from it. And I ended up, I probably had a concussion. And then
you had it in
I broke 2 ribs in many times in many places. And when they did the CAT scan, they discovered a mass on my thymus gland, which they said, you better have somebody take a look at this when you get back to Ohio, which is where I was living at the time. And it turned out that after, and it was actually funny, the surgeon, he was a great surgeon, he took it out. And he said, we're going to just take the whole thing out because you don't need the thymus gland anymore. It's something that's necessary in childhood. where it helps develop the immune system, I think. Any medical doctor would confirm that, I hope. That's what they told me anyway. And the doctor said, this is going to be fun. He was explaining all these different ways he can do this. And to him, it was fun. I said, for you, maybe. And I thought about it later. I said, you know, you want a doctor who's really enthusiastic about his work when he's going to cut you open. Anyway, everything came out. It was malignant, but it was totally encased. And, you know, who knows what that has prevented? You know, we don't know whether it would ever have grown or not, but I just feel so blessed with another serendipitous accident around the kid. So, all right. Thank you.
One over here.
My serendipitous, I was just in a conversation with Stuart and he was saying, well, you retired, so how have you discovered meaning in your new life? And, you know, one of my projects in my new life, my retired life, has been renewing my knowledge of Russian. And I, you know, throughout my whole professional life, I've been deeply engaged with China and Chinese. And my interest in Russian began here at Trinity in one of these Seabury classrooms. I had a Russian, well, first I met someone who a bunch of you know named Sam Castle, who later became my colleague in the history department at Trinity. And Sam was the son of Holocaust survivors. His father had been in the Red Army. And I was really impressed with him. At that point, I had no identifiable intellectual interests at all. And Sam said, you know, you really should take Russian, Michael. And there's a great professor of Russian whose name is Walter Levitt, and give it a try. And I had liked studying French. So I thought, okay, I'll study Russian. And Walter Levitt was a professor at Trinity. He was a master linguist. His real specialty was French. And he was one of those people, a true polyglot. Every language he spoke with a beautifully cultivated accent. So his Russian was, I don't know how this happened. I'd like to know more about his life, but you know, he graduated from Bowdoin and Yale before he came to Trinity. And so I began studying Russian, and then we had another professor who a lot of you probably remember named Tony Netting, who taught, a shortish professor who taught Russian history. Great history professor. So I fell in love with, you know, everything Russian literature and so forth. So to make a longer story short, I decided I'm going to really get back to Russian, and you know, I began once again. I bought an Olivetti Russian typewriter and began creating. learned to touch type in Russian and began creating my own vocabulary cards. Wow, and not many people can do that. I'm just kidding. A lot of Russians can. And so, you know, it's been coming back smoothly. And in the fall of 2022, I was in Southeast Asia and visiting Vientiane in Laos. And I was there. There's a gallery there, a woman who has revived weaving, an American woman who's revived weaving in Laos, has a gallery in Vientiane, Cal Cassidy. And I went to her gallery. I go there every time I'm in Vientiane, which is not very often. And as I was there, a group of Poles came in. And I don't speak Polish, but they were all of about our age. And I thought, oh, you know, Poland, you know, when they were kids, they studied, their second language was Russian. So I'll say hello in Russian. So they came in and I said, "Привет, как дела? Как вы поживаете?" And one of the Poles said to me, his face just turned red, and he said, "Я никогда хочу слышать этот ёпотный язык," which I won't completely translate. I never want to hear that expletive deleted language again. But nonetheless, my Polish friend's advice, I just went into the circular file. I continue to study Russian, and the serendipitous forces, Levitt, Kassaw, banquets, netting, really created a beautiful source of orientation for what are we calling it? The eighth inning? Well, later we'll be talking about that, but for the eighth inning, bottom of the no, top. We all hope we go into extended time.
I'll try and keep it short. This goes back, you all can remember, we graduated about 3 months after the Tet Offensive. And I had, let me turn off something. I had a graduate school program that I thought would perhaps get me a deferment from my draft board, and they laughed heartily at that. I got my notice, so I'll try another option. I joined the Army with the language option program. It cost you an extra year. It made you I spent a year at the Defense Language Institute. They wanted me to learn Bahasa Indonesian. And supposedly this would keep me out of NAM, right? Well, the answer, of course, is no. The Army had its own program. It took people who were linguists with all these excess languages. You didn't have a language they cared about at the time, but you were familiar with interpretation and translation it generically, so they could give you then an 8-week interrogator program at Fort, this isn't how, at Fort Hood, but Fort Holabird, and then you go to Hood, Texas, and go to the Great Swamp, NAM, and team you with the Vietnamese, and you as a trained linguist elsewhere could better interpret and translate what was done as nasty things would be done. So I signed up for Indonesian, then they said my program, just before we're beginning, that program in Indonesian was canceled. What do you want to do instead? We have a slot in Japanese rather. So I signed up for Japanese, and then did the whole program in Japanese for a year. And then I got the same message. Well, yeah, you're going to Holabird for an 8-week interrogator program, then to Fort Hood, and then to the Great Swamp. So, a series of combinations. The first serendipity was the Japanese language switch. The next was in a moment of quiet desperation and chutzpah on my way from Monterey to Fort Holabird. I stopped off at that funny shaped building on the other side of the river called the Pentagon, walked in the front door and said, "Which way to military intelligence assignments?" And they said, "Sublevel 3, section 4, room whatever, 100. Walked in there and said, "Sir," and it was actually a master sergeant, and said, "I have just finished a year's training in Japanese, and I think it would be to the Army's best interest, not necessarily mine, to send me to Japan." And this guy looked at me somewhat strangely, but evidently he'd had a good breakfast, or his wife had been nice to him, and he said, "Okay, you see that book over there? It was the size of the old dictionaries. It was all of the assignments in Japan and Korea." He said, "Pick one." So I started paging through and got to, as an order, I become an order of battle analyst attached to the U.S. headquarters, U.S. Army in Japan. And I'll take that one. Great. I go to Holabird, I take that program, and then I'm off to Japan. I thought I've now dodged the bullet. I am not going to go to Nam. I get to the headquarters, U.S. Army Camp Zama, Japan, and they said, "Oh, yeah, you. Budget change. Your job's been abolished." Look, across the street, there was this, see that building over there? It said Far East Relocation and Reassignment Center. And its job was to pick up excess people from Japan and Korea, weren't needed there, and then send them south to the Great Swamp, where they could be better made good use of. So at which point I had a short-term marketing issue, because that was a Monday night, and on Tuesday I was supposed to show up there, and I started just talking and found a very nice fellow who was in the He was the commander of the counterintelligence detachment protecting the U.S. Army in Japan, and said, here I am, I can be real useful for you because I have this language skill from these guys. He looked at me very, very strangely and said, well, maybe we can make this work. So luckily, the combination of switching from Indonesian to Japanese, finding this fellow in the Pentagon, and then finding this, find Commander Major Dacus of the 704th MID at Camp Zama, that was my serendipity, and I was very pleased for it.
Who next? Chaz.
I'm Chad Miller, and what happened to me when I finished Trinity, I did not get into medical school, and I didn't have a backup plan. So I went to Mexico and enrolled in Guadalajara at the medical school there. I can remember driving down through Mexico. I didn't speak Spanish. The courses were in Spanish. I could not even find the school because I couldn't talk to people. And I was thinking, boy, am I behind the 8 ball now. As it turned out, I worked very hard. I was able to transfer to Washington University in St. Louis, where I graduated medical school. And what happened to me, this was what I thought was a big disadvantage. Out of this experience, I learned a new culture. I learned a new language. I got a better sense of independence. I learned how to study. So all in all, it worked out very well for me. I think that had I gotten into medical school by the skin of my teeth, my life would not have been as good as it has been from my experience of going to Mexico.
That's great. Thank you.
Really? No. Did you run into a fellow named John Chutkowski? No, he was a couple of years ahead of us, but he ended up in Guadalajara and had a couple of years there before he got out of U.S. med school. John Chutkowski.
No,
No,
I didn't know him.
I think Guadalajara was a graduate school fraternity.
There's a guy named Jim Wilson.
Oh, yeah.
Who went there also.
There you go. Yeah.
And he went all 4 years, graduated, and he's now positioned in DC.
Great.
So I'll pick up on Chaz's comments about failure turning into serendipity. And I'm not sure whether well-deserved failure counts as serendipity, but I guess I would start with the Trinity connection. A good friend of mine from high school, a year ahead of me, I had gone to Amherst. So during senior year, I went to visit him at Amherst. I said, oh, this is the place for me. I applied there, early decision, failure. I applied regular decision, failure. So I came to Trinity. Worked out great. I can't imagine a better college experience and post-college experience, but the failure of not getting into Amherst gave me this. So that's one aspect of failure. Picking up on questions about how one doesn't get drafted, most of us will remember sitting around senior year and thinking about, okay, how do we avoid Vietnam? How do, are we going to move to Canada? And all of that stuff. And at the time, graduate school kind of deferred you. So when I went to law school, I got deferred, didn't have a law school, we got the numbers. Found my father actually found a judge advocate general program that I could apply for. And so I went for my physical to get into the JAG program. Now, all of us who went through high school sports had physicals in connection with sports. And the physical then consisted of turn your head and cough.
Let me down.
I didn't ask for those physicals. So I go to my JAG thing and I get to the last thing, where we're all standing in a row when they do the turn your head and cough. And the army guy there looks at me and says, boy, he says, and this is how he said, boy, he says, you got a hernia. And I said, oh, what's the impact of that on, well, you're going to have to go in there to that office there. But I tell you, if you don't get it repaired, you're going to one day feel like you're walking on your eyeballs. There's a chart. And it says hernia, one wide. So I said, I'm sorry, you can't get into this JAG program. And I turned over, I said, does that mean I won't get drafted either? So, yes. So that was the serendipity.
Oh, man.
And having all those physicals that I passed. And so my final note of failure, turning serendipitous. So I'm getting out of law school and I'm interviewing at law firms. And I had decided for a variety of reasons that rather than going back to my hometown of Philadelphia, I was going to apply to law firms in Boston. And I had interviews with several firms, including one firm called Hill and Barlow. Hill and Barlow had a great history in Boston. They had represented Sacco and Vanzetti, and they had this really good pro bono public service interest. And I was interviewed there by a young lawyer named Michael Dukakis. He was an associate at the firm, and I remember the interview, nice guy. And he said, I'm not totally sure that this firm is used to the fact that they've got a young lawyer here who wants to be governor someday. Okay. Anyway, because of that, Hill and Barlow, their history, this nice interview I had, became my first choice. Failure. They didn't offer me a job. So this other firm, where another friend of mine had gone, then named Dana, offered me a job, which I took. And years later, Hill and Barlow went under. And all the lawyers there had dispersed elsewhere. And the firm that I joined turned out to be a great career and representing some of the sports teams in town and everything. So again, those three failures kind of all led to good things.
That's great. Thank you.
You know, one thing I didn't learn until med school. Do you know when you're being checked for a hernia, why you have to turn your head? So you don't cough in the face of the doctor.
Wonderful.
So I'm, as almost everybody here knows, George Foskey, and senior year, like the rest of you, wondering what the heck am I going to do? And I luckily received a nomination, unbeknownst to me, to go to an interview at Yale, where I said, why am I here? And it turned out I ended up getting a trial year fellowship to divinity school from the Rockefeller Foundation. They paid the way. And the requirement for the fellowship is you can't want to go to divinity school. They were trying to attract people and seed the divinity school. So I said, great, I don't have to go to Vietnam. I can go up to Episcopal Divinity School, where my girlfriend from Conn College is a Harvard business school WAC reader, and we can have a great time. So anyway, I go up and I'm there with Mike Floyd and Dick Tyner. I think those are the only two from the class. They were serious about divinity school, and I was not. Social activist kind of guy. But anyway, we had to take a pastoral counseling course, which is really working in the community. So I worked in Lynn at a church there. I'd go up on Sundays and help out. So we're coming up to the end of the year, and I knew I'm not likely to stay around divinity school because I had no relationship to God. And that's really not what you want to do if you're in divinity school, not have a relationship to God. So I don't know what I'm going to do. And I happen to be wandering down the hallway, like in April or May, and a guy comes by me and says, hey, George, I can't do my pastoral counseling this Saturday. Would you cover for me? And I said, sure. And I think on Friday night, I went to him and I said, well, where is it? What is it? And he said, Charles Street Jail. So the big 1850 monstrosity and next to Mass General Hospital. So I go down there and I'm absolutely blown away. I go in, I wore the collar, but divinity students have to have a magic marker, a black line down it to mean you're not ordained, you're sort of halfway there. So I went and I was fascinated by it, and I came back and I said, gee, that was fascinating. He said, I hate it. So I said, I'll take over. So I did that till like the end of May or something. And then when school let out, I went down to the sheriff, Tommy Eisenstadt, and old Paul in Boston, had a meeting with him. And I said, Sheriff, I'll tell you what, I'll start a school and a library in the jail if you'll let me do this for free. And I worked as a bartender at night to sort of pay my way along. Had an amazing experience. And at the end, I was trying to get money from a new state agency that was reforming the criminal justice system. And I was working with this guy. And he said about middle of August, he said, George, I'm leaving my job. And you might be interested. I go in and get an interview, get hired, and the whole rest of my life is working in the criminal justice system. Because I walked down a hallway and said to a guy, I'll take your placement. Are you kidding me? How serendipitous is that?
Good, Emil.
Angelica, this spoiler alert, this is how a guy from New Jersey spends 50 years of his life in Minnesota. So when I freshman year here, when we were a little closer with him. So freshman year here, like everyone else, worried about what's going on with Vietnam, but thinking I'm safe because I'm in college. I get my draft notice while I'm here, first semester freshman year, and from New Jersey. And I say, well, how is this possible? And they say, well, we didn't meet our quota. So we have to go up to those in college. So my draft board couldn't meet its quota. So they picked me because my last name began with A. So I say, well, what can I do to not be drafted? And they said, well, if your school has an ROTC program, you can join that. And we won't draft you out of college. So fortunately, we had Air Force ROTC here. I joined it. I had no intention of doing that except for this little push from behind. And so I joined. Fast forward several years, I wind up getting an assignment to in a personnel department. And in those days, as a first lieutenant, or as a second lieutenant at the time, you have a chief master sergeant. And for those of you who are in the military, you know, they run the service, and they supposedly report to you, but they tell you what to do, and you do it. So so I had this great rapport with my chief master, and but one day he screwed up, and he screwed up really royally. And I realized he was a career guy. So I said, when the major came to raise hell, I said, you know, I'm the one that overrode his decision. It was on me. And I figured as a second lieutenant, they wouldn't do much to me. Well, they did a few things to me, but nothing that I cared about. And he said, I owe you one. Okay. So he owed me one. And he said, my advice to you as I was leaving for my next assignment, he said, be sure you volunteer to be the liaison to the community wherever you are assigned, because it will pay you off in the future. So as I walked out, I did that. Fast forward 2 years,
I'm a captain at this point. I still have another over a year to go. And sitting at my personnel office desk, the phone rings, I pick it up, and it's Chief Master Sergeant. And he says, I'm now at headquarters, U.S. Air Force. In 20 minutes, I will be sending out a Twixt. In those days, that's how they communicated around all the bases. I will be sending out a Twixt that says there will be an early out for all officers who have a request in for leaving the service. So he says, so you got about 20 minutes. What you're requesting. And if you can have that in, when the Twixt hits, they're going to freeze the pile and you'll be good. So I said, well, that's great news. What's the fastest form I can fill out in 20 minutes? And he said, well, that's an easy one. It's hardship discharge due to a pregnant wife. So I said, well, Chief, that's great, except I'm not married. And as far as I know, nobody's pregnant. And I, as a captain, I can't be called the hardship case. And he said, it doesn't matter. So I turned around, he says, it's 3/4 of a page, fill it out. You got 20 minutes, now you got 15 minutes. So I filled it out, threw it on the file, the Twixt came down, and I was out of the service, and I had volunteered to be the liaison to the community. And here I am in Duluth, Minnesota, and I'm given all kinds of job offers because I had been the liaison to the community. So the serendipity of actually the whole thing is how I wound up in Minnesota.
Oh, that is wonderful. God. I'll throw one in now if I may. A lot of the stories today have been about military and, shall we say, a little inefficiencies or odd situations. Mine was a little more interesting. I served in Vietnam, and toward the end of my term of service in Vietnam, I was transferred to one of the main cities in the province, well, the capital city of the province where I was assigned to be an operations officer, which meant essentially that I was responsible for supervising, overseeing communications, and so on, with all of the units in the province. It was basically a 12 hours on, 12 hours off gig. So every night, officers club, having a beer or two perhaps, and playing bridge, and kind of a good life. Well, I happened to befriend this person, well, a guy who had a similar job to what mine had been out in the field. He came in frequently to have a beer and relax and so on. Anyway, I got to know him very well, John Kundle. He was just a Midwestern guy from Iowa, and happened to be married to a woman that my best friend from high school had dated while they were at university. At any rate, he and I became good friends. I came home in April of 1970, was admitted to a graduate program in counseling psychology and college student personnel for that following fall. I walked into my first class that day, sat down and looked up, and there was John Kundle. And needless to say, we had a very vociferous and wonderful kind of reunion right there, embarrassed our hell out of ourselves in front of the other students. But he invited me to come over to his office. He was working in the financial aids office at the time. And so we were talking and so on. He offered me a graduate assistantship in the financial aid office. And it was during that assistantship that I realized, hey, this is what I enjoy, the opportunity to meet and assist prospective and current students to help them with, in this case, financial aid issues. And that really is what shaped my career. I ended up finishing up 2 graduate degrees and took positions in admissions, was the dean of students for several years, and finally ended up as associate director and then director of admissions at the university level. But had it not been for that chance encounter drinking beer at the officers club in Kramer compound, Quang Ngai City, and running into John Kundal, it certainly could have turned out differently. And it's just been, fortunate to say, I had a wonderful career. So. Hi, Jeff. Stories, anyone? Hey, John.
Thanks, John Hughes. I had absolutely no idea, how this was gonna play out, the theme, serendipity and all, until on the way over here, and George told me what my serendipity was. Thank you. Like many of us, I was trying to think of what to do when we graduated. Dan, I actually remember being in a group discussion with you about such things would be philosophical. Anyhow, one of the things I looked at was maybe officer candidate school. And surprisingly, I've done sort of mediocre on all standardized tests, but I did very well on that. And I think it was because I guessed. I had somehow been told you're not supposed to guess, or they had this vague thing that made you think you should guess. You should guess. There's no reason not to guess. I would have done better on a lot of things. Anyhow, so I was walking down the long walk and I ran into a friend of mine, Bill Shortell, who I want to give a little shout out here to Bill Shortell. I've stayed in touch with him, and he told me about this program Vista, which is like the Peace Corps in the United States. Okay, let me just say that Bill has made an entire career of politics in an extreme way. He worked for 35 years as a machinist so that he could be a labor organizer. He's in Europe now at some peace conference. I mean, he's brothers are still red. Okay, and so anyhow, he went into Vista and I went into Vista, and then we met up because there was an organization at the time called the National Vista Alliance, where those of us who didn't like what the Nixon administration was going to do to Vista, they're going to kind of emasculate it, and sure there's a more gender, less specific expression for that, but neuter it. And so we were both on this national steering committee, and our friendship grew in many ways from that. But the main thing was joining Vista, because since I was 2.5 years old, I'd always been in school. And George, you mentioned that I'm a little different now than you remember me in school. And that's because in my internal life, I was kind of on a downward spiral, psychologically, socially, and everything else when I was here. And I was also the kind of person who would, have a shaky piece of paper while I was talking. And I used to kid with Emil that, I'm a late bloomer. I mean, I had to believe in something. So Vista changed me so much. I was with people from all different kinds of situations. People would say, well, why did you decide to go to such and such a college? Well, I wanted to be closer to this disc jockey that I really admired. And, I'm like, really? And all that kind of thing. I was kind of away from the, suburban Boston educational world. Trinity, with all its advantages, was, in that same kind of environment. Even though I have so many very good friends from here. At any rate, though, it really opened me up. It gave me a chance to be, I think, more of what I liked in myself. And
I could go on with that, but it just, I had a lot, I got the confidence. A lot of the confidence, the feeling about myself, being myself. From having talked to Bill and having, going and suggesting that. And following his suggestion and really changing my life, my location, and I'm here to talk about it.
Go.
Okay, speaking of giving shout outs to various experiences, et cetera, I'm gonna give a shout out to Keith Miles here in the context of this story. But first of all, I'd like to preface it by, a lot of these stories remind me of a musical. If anyone saw If Then, it only got mixed reviews on Broadway, but I would suggest if you are into musicals, and I'm really enjoy musicals, that you listen to a lot of the songs in it, because they relate to what we're talking about, because where is the serendipity start in terms of these things that we're talking about? I mean, I came to Trinity when I was accepted at Brown, because I didn't think I could play football at Brown. I wanted to play football at Trinity. And who do I meet freshman year? But Keith, dude. And we become great friends. And I go into education and, committed to, out of the 60 generation, committed to teaching. And I end up teaching in a ghetto school in Boston. Jonathan Kozol, death at an early age, all that shit. That was my experience. And I talked to Kim about this. And Kim, serendipitously, happened to be working for the Ford Foundation. And the Ford Foundation, he worked for a guy by the name of Chuck Brown, who was a superintendent in schools in Newton, who was looking for people to go into administration, who had a different path to follow in terms of teaching. I mean, I was one of three teachers who crossed the picket line in a Boston school strike in 1970. And that was an interesting experience, phone calls, threats and stuff like that. And Kim said, Ford Foundation has this particular program that is looking for people who didn't come out of the normal track to go into administration to make changes in education. And Kim said, throwing your name into this program, and they had a number of them across the country. And I was fortunate enough with coming on, having 4 children in 5 years, at the age of 22 to 27, to be supported by Father Ford and Kim indirectly at Columbia University, and went on to
your wife Jeannie.
And went on to what was an incredible career, I think, in education in a variety of positions. And it was serendipitous that I chose Trinity over Brown, that I played football with Kim. We became great friends, and eventually he really was the stepping stone to me becoming what my career was.
That's great.
Sorry, I just have an addendum to what Joe said there. He's a very smart boy. And if you look back under yearbook and paper and newspaper things, he, as he mentioned, is a very good friend of Kim's. And Kim would be like, he always stood next to Tim on the sidelines, and so in the paper would be, or in the yearbook, Miles scores 3 touchdowns. And this is Joe McKee next to him.
Let me
Addendum number 2.
The real story in it for the paper is that, I will throw a screen pass on about the 10-yard line to Larry Roberts. Larry runs 90 yards, scores the touchdown, and the paper will the next day say, Miles throws 90-yard touchdown.
That's wonderful.
All right, I've got a story, and a lot of these stories do relate to this period of time, 1968, and that was really a unrest throughout the whole country, and with unrest here at Trinity College as well. My story is that I met my wife Noblet, and we've been married now for 55 years, but we were talking about, well, what do we do next? And we decided we'd go into the Peace Corps. And so we went down to Bolivia, and we lived on the Altiplano at about 12,000 feet with the Aymara Indians. And the Aymara had been basically slaves until about 1954, when Paz Estancero had this revolution in Bolivia. And the Hacienda people, the patrons, were booted off the land, and there was agrarian reform, and each of these Aymara Indians now had their own plot of land. And they also, the other part of it was every campesino was given a gun by Paz Estancero, and that was to make sure that the revolution wasn't undone. But anyway, those 2 years we lived in an adobe house down there, no electricity, running water, and it was pretty remote. But the people were very nice to us, and we had the advantage that my wife was a very good learner of languages, and in this training program, a fellow by the name of Pedro Capana was brought here as an Aymara person to teach the females how to speak Aymara, because none of the females in this village were bilingual in Spanish. But anyway, she became, Pedro Capana said, why don't you come to my village? I want you guys there. And so it was very comfortable to go to his village because it was so well respected, and there was an easy entree for us. And a lot of Peace Corps volunteers didn't have the advantage that we had there. But those 2 years living with the Aymaras was, it was certainly a broadening perspective, and I think it changed our whole life in our values and so forth. So that's what happened to me during that period of time. Right.
Thank you, Bill.
Bill, was that something where the Peace Corps assigned you there, or you chose it?
The country of Bolivia was, we were just assigned there. But our particular village, we went there because of this fellow Pedro Capana. The end of the story is we went back 40 years later, and my wife and I, we were still traveling like we did back then, hopping on trucks and buses and so forth. And we got off a truck in Compi, our town, and nobody immediately recognized one of the ladies at her age and started visiting with them. And I looked down the street and I said, that's Pedro Capana. And I yelled out, hey, Don Pedro. And he yelled back, Don Guillermo. That was 40 years later. And I played soccer down there at 12,000 feet. And the whole soccer team was still there in the town. And it was good to see everybody again. Anyway, it was a good 2 years. We had a kerosene heater and a kerosene lamp, and every night the soccer team or some members of it would come to play Monopoly. And these guys would want to play a complete game of Monopoly, which takes a long time. And that's how we spent a lot of evenings. Anyway, okay, that's my story. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
I thought of, I'm Barry Bedrick. I thought of two stories actually, and one was quintessential Trinity sports story. But I thought I'd choose the other one because it's dripping with serendipity, the story of how I met my wife. When I left Trinity, I taught at Loomis, which is now Loomis JV, for 4 years. And that was a wonderful experience, but I think by the end of that, I was ready for something different. So I decided to go to Europe, primarily because in '72, the Olympics were being held in Munich. And I always thought I would want to see Munich, and I always definitely wanted to experience the Olympics. I was Olympic fan for various reasons. My father was an All-American diver and probably would have been in the Olympics if not for Hitler and the Berlin mess. So he never had a chance to do that. So anyway, I was there actually in the Olympic Village at the time of the Israeli assault. And I think in some ways it changed me. I really experienced a lot of it from various perspectives. But one of the perspectives I felt was the people of Munich were so eager to get past the ugliness of their previous history, that the whole city had come out in every way imaginable to try and make visitors feel welcome. In fact, the whole city was covered in pastels. The signs were in pastels. Everything was immaculately clean. Women were cleaning the escalators coming up from the trains every morning. Everywhere you looked, people were welcoming and kind and friendly and hopeful. And this just changed everything overnight. If you can imagine being in a big city with people from all over the world, and just there to have fun and meet each other, it was buzzing, and it was sensational to be in there because I met so many interesting people. And then all of a sudden, everything stops. The game stopped, and I can tell you that the city went silent after the assault on the village. It went silent. You could almost hear a pin drop in a major city for like 2 or 3 days. So that's the introduction. And at the end of my time in Europe, at the end of '72, I moved back to Connecticut and moved into an apartment complex in Rocky Hill. And there suddenly in December was one of those infamous ice storms, which resulted in a major blackout. We were without power for 4 days. So I was wandering around in the dark in this blackout, climbing the stairs, and I bumped into 2 women, literally. And we got to talk a little bit, and they said, "Hey, we're having a blackout party. Why don't you come on down?" So I did. And I got to this apartment, and it was so jammed with people, they had filled the apartment so that I couldn't get into the apartment, but what I could do was sit down at the doorstep. So I sat down at the doorstep, and lo and behold, there was this woman there that I began to talk to. Her name was Susan. And it turns out that she had just gotten out of the Air Force. She had served during Vietnam as an Air Force nurse, and we got to chatting. And that was kind of the end of that. The blackout eventually ended, and a couple of weeks later, I was roaming around, and she was roaming around. We bumped into each other in the elevator, and she said, "I want to invite you to come to dinner for New Year's Day." So that was really the beginning. And that was the first piece of serendipity. We were married in 1976 in the Trinity College Chapel. And we renewed our vows in 2011 in the Trinity College Chapel. We were married by Ellen Tull, and we renewed our vows with Dan Heischman. Some of you will know Dan. We got to know Dan because I became headmaster in private schools, one of them being an Episcopal school. Dan became eventually, after leaving Trinity, the head of the National Association of Episcopal Schools. And I met Dan through that vehicle, and we ended up being good friends. And when we saw Dan in San Francisco, Susan, of course, in her inimitable way, asked Dan if he would officiate our vow renewal ceremony. And of course, he said yes. And Larry and Deb Roberts were there, and we had a wonderful time. The last part of it is that Dan did an absolutely beautiful ceremony, but he wrote a special homily. And the homily was really, I think, a treatise on marriage, on what a good marriage should be. We're now getting ready to celebrate our 47th year. Dan, in his homily, did research on all of the literature and poetry of ice storms. In the homily, he read and talked about these various experiences that writers had with ice storms. The homily ended by Dan saying, "Who knew an ice storm could do all that?"
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. Ward? Can you hear us, Ward?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
That's amazing. I'm using my wife's laptop, which usually doesn't produce good sound. Yeah, I'm just introduce myself very briefly. I'm not class of year 68, right? I am class of 68, but Penn Law School. But I was a Trinity 65 grad. And I do have a story that sort of relates to what a lot of everybody else has said. I too was a child of the 60s. A little bit later than you guys. I was lucky enough that when I started law school, they were still giving deferments, so I got deferred through law school, and I got to my last year of law school, and I had 1 year of draft eligibility left. And I thought, well, I think the best way to deal with this is to go become a member of the office, the Navy JAG. That's what I wanted to do. So I went down to the recruiting place in Philadelphia, and I went for the physical and all that stuff. And just like some of you guys, I got to the very last stage of the physical, and I was told that my blood pressure was just a little too high for JAG, and that therefore I couldn't become an officer in JAG, but I was still low enough to be perfectly good draft bait. So I had images of a friend of mine from college who'd been on the radio station, who ended up over in Play Coast stringing barbed wire. And I thought, that does not sound like what I want. So I ended up, because they were recruiting at that point to law school, I ended up becoming a VISTA lawyer, a VISTA volunteer. Which was a deferrable thing, although I did get a couple of draft notices while I was in VISTA, but they took care of it. And what I want to say about this that sort of fits into this story is that experience, the VISTA experience, totally changed my life. I'd gone to law school with a very clear picture of what I wanted to do when I came out of law school, the same sort of thing I had done when I was a second-year student in law school, clerking for a sort of a white-collar kind of middle-class suburban law firm, and that was kind of what I wanted to do. I said, yeah, that would be nice. I could do some wills and trusts. I could do some adoptions, handle occasional divorces, real estate closings, all that kind of stuff. And that was kind of my plan for it once I got out of law school. But then I ended up going to a training session that was run by a guy named Howard Higman at the University of Colorado.
Me too.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about. Howard Higman's claim to fame was that he had spent much of his life as a sociology professor training union organizers. And he had a very, very sort of shock and awe approach to training. I remember sleeping in sleeping bags in public housing. I can remember living in a migrant shack down in the San Luis Valley in Colorado for a while. And basically what he did in that training was to sort of show people what it's like to be poor, which is to say you got absolutely no handle in the system. From there, I ended up going to northeastern Iowa, which itself has a long story connected to it because it was right after the '68 race riots. But we ended up there. And about a third of the way through the year, I said, you know, I can't do with my law school training what I wanted to do. I just can't do it. It ain't right. The system is too screwed up for me to be doing, you know, sort of basically holding the hands of wealthy middle-class people. And from that, I went back. I did go back to New Jersey after my year in Vista. I spent a year in legal aid. I spent another year in private practice, but doing divorce work. And then I said, long story short, I ended up as an environmental lawyer working for the state of Pennsylvania doing enforcement work. And as I said, that whole thing was just because of making that one decision that I wanted to be a Navy JAG guy, and I couldn't make it. So anyway, I'm not even in your class, but I really appreciate a chance to share. And I know lots of people outside of my life as a volunteer, as a lawyer too, that have similar stories to tell. It was a wonderful topic, a great idea. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
If I can just make a thing, it's not serendipity, but it's on the program. It's obvious from the conversations here and what we know about each other, et cetera, that the Vietnam War was very important time, and avoiding it was very important. I don't know how many people in our class actually ended up in the military, but I believe one person was killed. Whose name is on the wall, and I don't remember the name of Tony. Maybe you can have, you know, a 15 or 30 second silence in memory of him. It was important and the one that we lost.
You know, I don't know if there was a mission at Trinity, but we all sort of seem to have gone into a service / caring for people, like vocation, profession. And I don't know if that was the times that motivated us to do that, or that was just our luck, the 1960s. But I just think that mission, purpose that we gathered from each of us made our lives very worthwhile.
I just had to dovetail for a minute because he mentioned something that I know a lot about. I was trained by this fellow, Howard Hickman, as well. He ran the program, and actually I worked for him. After being a Vista, I then trained Vistas for 6 weeks. It was a very intense program, and that was the beginning of changing everything. And you know, related to what you're talking about, I think that it was especially true of people who went into Vista, that they couldn't go into just accumulating personal wealth. And the idea of service, I think, is also something that came out of Trinity. And when I describe people from Trinity, that makes them a little different maybe than my Vista friends, is that nobody seems to have done anything in a half-assed manner. You know, maybe that's the problem I was having as a student. But anyhow, everyone, I mean, there's been so many people who have really excelled in their work. And, you know, that's an important legacy, I think, of the school. So, thanks.
Amen.
So it just occurred to me that serendipity, it befell all of us for the 4 years that we were at Trinity. Right? So we show up, I graduated with all of you in '64 from high school. I come up here. We have mandatory chapel attendance. We're wearing coats and ties. Women are allowed in the dorms only on Sundays for what, an hour, couple hours or something?
15 minutes.
So I've got a buzz cut, from like, I'm looking like a flat top kind of a guy. And what happened to us? In 4 years, we have women living in the dorms. We're sex, drugs, and rock and roll crazy, right? I mean, it's a complete, has anybody had a 4-year experience where the social change that we went through and the circumstances that surrounded us was as impactful as that? I mean, maybe there are, but not in modern US times. I mean, I guess when the GIs came back in the Second World War or something, but that 4-year period, am I kidding myself? Or is that really a special serendipitous that we showed up in 64 and left in 68?
Well, exactly. In 69, women were there.
Yeah.
It wasn't, it was a part of our experience, but it was just after we left. It became.
They were very lucky. I'm sorry, I guess I'm just the addendum guys. I remember just as he said that when we first came in as freshmen, remember there were pride hours where you could have women on Sunday for 2 hours. or something. Okay, in 4 years, the true story. I remember coming out of or going into the bathroom, here's a woman with nothing on. Okay, coming out of the shower smoking a joint. Absolutely a true story.
And they also remember alcohol and taking it away from us was a big issue. And I remember in senior year, you opened the door to your dorm room and you were smelling marijuana all over.
Yeah.
Can we march on the Capitol?
Yes.
Yeah.
Second day, we were.
I have to say something about that. I have the photograph. New York Times, news of the world in review. In photographs, Trinity students, we want movies. Honestly, I managed Walt Harris and some others, and it's kind of embarrassing, but it's quite it was within the first couple of weeks of our freshman year, and
Not in Kansas anymore.
and so we went from protest to
The signature sign from the march on the Capitol.
We want booze.
Just respect that this.
we
I'm
went
gonna
from-
die with my booze on.
See, so I'm reminded of senior year. So a number of us who were here went to this restaurant in West Hartford last night, got together and stuff, and we walked by a private dining room where there was a sign that said, trustees of Trinity College dinner meeting. And as I'm walking out, I'm thinking, the class of 68, we should just barricade.
Yeah.
You also got to remember that there's-
Oh, that's-
We had a dress code. You had to wear a tie to dinner. But somebody here wore only a tie.
Yeah.
Other clothing.
And you realize we would have barricaded one of our classmates in there.
Yes, yeah. Well, and just walking by was so different because the sit-in was largely. And in 68 was largely an effort to induce the trustees to do more for minority students. That's right. Than had been done. You walked by the trustee dinner last night and I didn't do counting, but there's a good representation of
Yeah.
minorities on the board of trustees, so.
Well, as long as we're being nostalgic, rooms like this didn't have carpet.
Right.
We would smoke in class and just put the down there and then later on, someone coming to clean it up. Good old days.
I don't even see. Not his little people.
I did.
Liar.
I have one. I'm Richard Morris, and those of you who don't, I took my junior year abroad, from University of Pennsylvania. And while I was there, I had the good fortune of being able to take any course in the university.
graduate or undergraduate. Which was wonderful. And I ended up in the Department of City Planning, which was a wonderful experience. And the guys were all graduate students. They taught me how to study. They taught me what group study was all about, how you would get 10 or 12 questions. Each guy took a question and did a complete analysis of it. And then you got together as a study group and went over the questions. You had all the answers. It was a wonderful experience. I came back for my senior year and applied to city planning school, figuring that that would be a place to go. And I was accepted in Canada at the University of Vancouver. And I then walked over to my draft board on my Thanksgiving holiday and said, listen, here's my letter of acceptance to the university for city planning. And the lady said, what the hell is city planning? So I said, well, that's not going to be an exemption. So then I came back and I said, okay, what are my choices? And at that point I was engaged, and my lovely bride-to-be said, you better get a job and not get drafted. So I figured out that she had an aunt who was involved in the City of Philadelphia School Board in personnel. And I was given a job. I had a choice. I had a choice of 2 junior high schools, one where they spoke Spanish. Well, I spoke French. And I could be in an inner city junior high school, which is the one I took. So consequently, I came back and I had to get a master's degree in education, because this was before things were really nuts about qualifications to be a teacher, because they needed men in the schools. So I took the ed exam, and you all remember Mike Williams. He sat next to me. And we took the exam, and I'm groaning through the test. And after the test, a couple of weeks later, we got the results back, and we both did very well. And he said, it's a damn good thing I was next to you, because every time you groaned, I look at the question, I change my answer. So he went on to an MAT program at Harvard, and I finished my master's here at Trinity in 2 summer programs. So, and that allowed me to get a full certificate in the state of Pennsylvania when I gave them my master's degree certificate. But when I taught in Philadelphia, it was a double split school, started at 7:30 to 1 and 1 o'clock to 5. And they never had enough teachers. So I was in the early session, and then I would stay and cover the classes because I became a substitute teacher. And then that experience, I started a program at Penn for getting certified to be a principal. So Joe, I was following in your footsteps. And then we moved to Connecticut, where I taught at the high school, Weaver High School, where I became the district chairperson for social studies. So all of these things happened because I couldn't become a city planner. But I stayed up with city planning because for those of you who are in Virginia and Reston and all the things that were happening, those were the guys that I was in school with at Penn. They were the ones who were the movers and the shakers. And coincidentally, my parents knew the head of city planning for City of Philadelphia. And I had a chance to meet with him. And I said, how are things doing in this? He said, it's the worst political job you could ever have. And you're not going into the business was probably the smartest thing you ever did, because you're at the whim of the politician.
Yeah.
You can have the best plans in the world, but unless you can get it funded, it doesn't happen. So I ended up in education, and my wife's family said, come into the family business. I said, no, I'm in education. I'm here for good. And then my father got sick. We came back to Philadelphia, and I couldn't get a job in education. So I went into the family business, and I've been there now, still working, on call today for 40-some years. So it's been interesting.
That's great. Are there any others? Bill?
I want to add something to the city planning comments. Let me have that microphone a minute. Okay, so President Biden has got a program right now about the damage that was done to a lot of cities through the construction of interstates, just separating out the minorities. And maybe you guys remember Clyde McKee, he was a government professor.
Yeah.
Anyway, I did the honors thesis with him and it was urban renewal in Hartford. And we were doing that right here in Hartford. We put I-84 through just to block off the blacks on their side of town. Well, and they called it urban renewal at that time too.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just wanted to add that.
Thank you.
The other people call it urban renewal. Do you guys remember senior year, we had a visiting professor, Constantinos Doxiadis?
Yeah.
Yes.
Who was like this world-renowned city planner, and I remember his basic thesis was that due to the development of the Northeast, by this time, there would be absolutely no open space at all. So much for Constantinos Doxiadis' prediction.
And speaking of McGee, it was government, but in religion, Al Rabel, who I think was an incredible influence on a lot of us, had in his course The Life and Death of American Cities by Jane Jacobs, which is a seminal piece about urban renewal and about the importance of neighborhoods, and really took the old West End. I was born in the West End of Boston, Poplar Place, that now is Charles River Park next to Mass General, and basically destroyed the old West End, which was an Irish Italian neighborhood that still is found in Boston, basically Italian in the North End, but just jumping on the urban renewal and Trinity and the guy in the religion department who spoke to those issues that we're talking about, Al Rabel. A lot of influence on me and some of the other people there.
We had this room until 11 o'clock, but actually no further use is set till, did you say 1, Dan, or was it noon?
Well, we have a session here at 3.
Yeah, I was gonna,
We have a luncheon too.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
luncheon at what time?
the luncheon at the Half Century Club
so
is
we're
noon.
back here in this room at 3:30.
3:30.
Program on legacy. And
Yeah, lunch at the Mather Hall Ween Terrace. Is that right?
The Half Century Club.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
also the alumni bicentennial, so what are the rest of the best ones, and which one are we gonna do?
What if people find it?
So I think just given our wisdom, what is our age, we're all.
Half century, half century.
So I think we're all, it's all anticipated, I think. We can go to the half century. You know, because it's-
And we're the special folks.
Paul,
Yeah.
I gotta answer this question. What lunch should we go to?
Half century.
Whichever you wish.
Well,
I-
No, they're,
Half century.
the half century is,
So.
George, you're in the half century club, aren't you?
If you look in your little book,
You're in the half century club.
the luncheon tickets.
I think somebody. School needs city planning, but also.
Half Century Club.
Half Century Club, you're right? You didn't get one because you signed up late. Yeah, you. Oh.
Got dessert.
Did you sign up late?
Still.
I'll share my. Half century, George.
yeah.
Place you can rent Mather Hall, Ween Terrace, rooms and Washington. So apparently it's spread out.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you all very much.
All right. Nice talk to the tech.
Thank you.